Hello, I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern14.com, joined by Blake Lovell, also of Southeastern14.com. We are here to preview Tuesday night Southeastern Conference basketball action. Blake, let's go in order of the four games, order of tip-off, that is. You've got South Carolina going to Tennessee. The Gamecocks came in and upset Vanderbilt in Nashville on Saturday. That was Carolina's first road win of the year. The Gamecocks stay on the road, go to Knoxville for a Tennessee team that hasn't been playing that well, got beat up pretty good in Baton Rouge, but have a feeling Tennessee's going to play much better this time around.
Yeah, I think playing at Tennessee is a interesting, more difficult challenge than probably the Vanderbilt game for South Carolina, even though they're both on the road. And you're obviously going up against just an elite defensive team. And I don't think Tennessee's looked that bad thus far. I mean, they're 1-2 in the SEC, but I think when you consider that, two of those games have been on the road against Alabama and LSU, I don't really, and like you said, one was shorthanded. I don't really think there's that much concern if you're Tennessee. I know they struggled to beat Ole Miss in overtime, but I just think the Vols will probably, figure it out as they're going along here. And again, this is still a team that's already proven they can, beat a team like Arizona, and they've got some other good wins in there, throughout the season. So I feel like this is the kind of game that really benefits a Tennessee type team. And as always, we can only go off of what we've seen. And I just don't think South Carolina's, a good offensive team. I think they're solid, but I just think that there's a lot of things that Tennessee's going to be able to do defensively that will probably, cause some issues for South Carolina. But on the flip side, there's probably some things that South Carolina will do defensively as well that'll maybe cause some issues for Tennessee. So as usual, it seems like Tennessee has kind of become that team we've labeled in some of these games. I think this may play out somewhat similar to that game against Ole Miss, where it's kind of a low-scoring type matchup, you would think, just based on how these two play defense. Still, though, I think you give the edge to Tennessee certainly in a game like this, and I think this is kind of one of those big sort of bounce-back possibilities for them after that loss at LSU.
Ken Palm's got this as about a 14-point game. We haven't seen a line on that, but if that's where the line is, who would you take?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because, again, I don't think Tennessee's been overwhelming to the point that you feel comfortable or confident in them covering, an almost 15-point spread. I think that's I'd probably be a little hesitant on that just because, again, this could be a sort of a lower scoring game, even though both teams kind of get up and down the floor. If you look at kind of the tempo and all those kind of things, these are two teams that play at a pretty fast tempo offensively, at least. And it's tricky just because I think that South Carolina is going to make it sort of a grind at times. And, I don't really look at Tennessee as a team that's a great 3-point shooting team, which obviously means that, they're not going to be necessarily just push out a score as much, maybe as such a quick fashion. So I may lean towards South Carolina in that scenario, although I think Tennessee still wins this game and maybe even does it by double digits. I just think that, from what we've seen thus far, Tennessee to me isn't the kind of team against this sort of competition. Yeah, maybe they did against, inferior competition earlier in the non-conference slate, but I think they're a team that maybe sort of lets teams hang around a little bit too long, as we've seen in some of these games. And I think that could be the case here. But again, as we go back to what we always say, you just don't know what you're going to get from South Carolina. And I think that's probably the bigger issue in trying to figure out how a game like this is going to play out.
Yeah, South Carolina has been a dreadful team away from home the last 2 years. Now, having said that, Carolina just came off a win at Vanderbilt, but let's be honest, Blake, you and I both live in the Nashville area. Vanderbilt doesn't have a home court advantage anymore. There were maybe 3,000 people in that building Saturday. I was there for that, and by the way, we'll get to Vandy next, but that's the thing. I think that I tend to push towards Tennessee in this one just because of that, if nothing else.
Well, I think South Carolina is just the kind of team that can frustrate Tennessee. That's probably the best way to put it. I think that, just Frank Martin's teams, how they play, they're going to be aggressive. And, that's another team that's really just going to attack the paint and probably get some, points there. And on defensively, they're going to just be, a team that's going to force turnovers and those kind of things. Tennessee's done a good job of taking care of the ball for the most part, but it's a tricky one, as we always say. I mean, we're still so early in conference play that it's hard to get a read on some of these teams. And quite frankly, I think South Carolina is one of the hardest teams to get a read on at this point. And, like I said from the beginning, it's going to be much more of a challenge than it was at Vanderbilt. But, if you go by what you've seen from Tennessee did beat a shorthanded Ole Miss team, by 6 in overtime. And I don't know. I think this is one that you're banking on, an SEC team right now outside of maybe, Georgia, not even Missouri at this point, which we'll talk about based on what they did over the weekend. I think it's just hard to, predict the team to win by almost 15 points when you kind of see how the matchups play out like this. So.
Okay, let's move about 3 hours to the west of Knoxville to Nashville, where Vanderbilt had its 4-game winning streak snapped by South Carolina Saturday in Memorial. Kentucky beat Georgia pretty handedly. Ty Washington set, I think, a school record for assists in that one with 15. Just after Xavier Wheeler had gone down, he takes over the point guard duties. Kentucky, according to Ken Palm, a 7-point favorite in Nashville. Kentucky has won, I don't know how many in a row in that series at this point. Vanderbilt lost Rodney Chapman during that game with the hamstring injury, and my guess is he's not going to be back. He was the guy that had sort of put Vanderbilt over the top in that recent winning streak. And he's not a guy where the stuff shows up in the box score, but he can be kind of a disruptive defender. And they really struggled with him out of the game. Scottie Pippen Jr. had to handle the ball more, had 7 turnovers. I think Kentucky's going to come in, which they bring a lot of fans to Nashville anyway. And Vanderbilt is not allowing its own students in the building for the first 5 games of conference play, one of which has been played already. So those student tickets, which are right on top of you, have gone on sale. I don't think Vanderbilt's going to have the home court advantage in its own building, and frankly hasn't had much of one in its own building for a while anyway. Kentucky's not been good on the road, but again, I'm skeptical, and this is crazy to say if you grew up watching the SEC. I'm not sure Vanderbilt's going to have the home court advantage in its own building, Blake.
I was going to say, I don't even think that's an unsure. I think it's a home game for Kentucky. I don't know any other way to put it. I think that it's going to be, as much of it's not going to be rough, but it's going to be a lot of blue as there's always been in Kentucky and Vanderbilt games in Nashville. But I think this year, especially, like you said, there's no students. That's going to be all blue in that area, right on the floor. I think this is essentially a home game for Kentucky. And I think because of that, and I don't like the matchup anyways for Vanderbilt. I think it's just it's not a great matchup in terms of how the two teams play. And like you mentioned too, if Chapman doesn't play, I like it even less for Vanderbilt based off of that. So I just looking at this match, diving into the different, types of matchups here that you're going to get with this, I lean way towards Kentucky in this one because I don't see, without Chapman, with some of the issues we saw with Vanderbilt against South Carolina, Kentucky's just a better team. And, I think you look at what Kentucky's probably going to be able to do especially on the glass. I think this is a game where Tshiebwe could just, go off. I think he could have a huge game here. And, again, you kind of look at the different factors for Vanderbilt. I just don't think they've been consistent enough offensively for them to be able to probably keep up with Kentucky in this one. That's where, you've got to limit every possible second chance opportunity you can if you're Vanderbilt. And I think that's going to be a hard thing to do because we know Kentucky's going to get most of their points from inside the arc. And if not, they'll probably find a way to get to the free throw line at times. So I think this is just, like I said, there's a couple things. It's the nature of this feeling like a home game for Kentucky. And I think it's just a bad matchup for Vanderbilt overall. Yeah.
Vanderbilt had a real headache with South Carolina in the post. And South Carolina is not one of those teams that you think of as a team that just beats you down in the paint. But Vanderbilt had Quentin Millora-Brown got in foul trouble in that game Saturday, and they just had nothing. They got Jermaine Mann, who's their backup post at this point. They list him at 6'6". I think he's more like 6'4". I think with Tshiebwe, that's just a nightmare matchup. I don't think either of us are very conflicted on this one. I think Kentucky wins this one easily. So let's move on to Ole Miss and A&M, which I think is a sneakily intriguing game. I've watched a lot of Ole Miss the last 2 weeks or the last 2 games. Ole Miss just handled Mississippi State from the jump in that game Saturday and darn near beat Tennessee and Knoxville. The game before that, Ole Miss, as we have talked about, will defend you. Ole Miss is without Jarkel Joyner, but actually playing better without him. Matt Morrell has really stepped up for them and kind of become a go-to scorer the last 2 games. I'm not sure he missed a shot from the field and went for about 30 against Mississippi State. I like the way Ole Miss is playing right now, Blake, but I like the way that A&M's playing too, and they're also at home.
Yeah, just real quickly on Vanderbilt, Kentucky, I was looking it up before we went into this one. If there is one thing, if you want to lean towards Vanderbilt, is for the most part, since Jerry Stackhouse has been there, Vanderbilt's played Kentucky pretty close in almost every game those two have played, which they play, twice a year, I think, since he's been there. And most of those games have been pretty close. So that is something worth noting on that, both home and away in that series. But on this one, listen, there's plenty of room for anybody that wants to jump on the A&M bandwagon right now because I'm hopping on. I think that they're a team, like we said, going into it. I thought that maybe we just didn't know what to sort of think of them. It was hard to get a read on who they were. And I'm not just saying this coming off a game against Arkansas, which we'll talk about Arkansas's issues at another time. As for A&M and Ole Miss, I think that, we didn't really know what to expect from A&M coming into conference play because we just didn't have a good read on what they were going to be. And I think just watching them that Arkansas game, you can see that there's a lot of possibilities for this team and what I think they're going to be able to do. You look at the balance they had in that game. I think they had, 6 or 7 guys between 9 and 16 points. That's as good as it gets when you're talking about just having a little bit of everything from everyone. And they were very efficient. We know Arkansas is having their own issues right now, but I think A&M is pretty good. And, it's going to take quite a push, I think, for them just based off of the schedule to make that push for an NCAA tournament bid. But, man, if they keep playing like they have been thus far, you go back and just kind of look at how their season's gone. I think this is another kind of game where I'm probably going to lean towards A&M because it is in College Station. Ole Miss has been playing better, but if you just look at it, I still think A&M's kind of that team. And we teased this about a week ago. We said, hey, if they can beat Georgia on the road, then you've got a struggling Arkansas team. You could be 2-0. Then you got an Ole Miss at home. That could be 3-0. Then you go to Missouri, which, may be more of a challenge based on what Missouri did to Alabama. But there is a possibility that A&M could be looking up at 4-0 to start SEC play. And I think I probably lean towards them in this game. I just think that the balance they have right now, when you just kind of look at, what you're getting from them defensively. But this is also a team that, like we talked about, they have been surprisingly, elite from 3-point line. I didn't think they'd be as good of a shooting team as they have been, but I think I probably lean towards A&M with this one. Although if it's close, we always say they are one of the worst free throw shooting teams in the country, so that's always something to keep in mind.
By the way, tying up a loose end here, Matt Morrell missed 1 shot and scored 31 points against State. That was a 2-point shot. That's one of the more efficient offensive performances we've had. So you're liking the Aggies in this one. And let's finish up with Alabama and Auburn here. Auburn had a little more trouble with Florida than I thought it would Saturday. Colin Castleton had a really nice game against Walker Kessler. Alabama just looked awful at Missouri. And Alabama, we've talked about it. It has just done inexplicable things at times, but I don't think it's really done them 2 games in a row. This one in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a 1-point favorite on Ken Pom. How do you see this one?
Well, I think this is all about what you get from Alabama. I think that's it. This is a tough game for Auburn on the road. We know. This is a rivalry game. It's it's going to be a challenge. I think even as good as Auburn's been, it's going to be a challenge on the road. But that's with the expectation that you're going to get the good Alabama here. And quite frankly, you don't know what you're going to get with Alabama at this point. There's no excuse to lose at Missouri the way that they lost. 6-point loss is misleading. That game never felt like it was that close, and that was, I think, the most disappointing thing was to see that a Missouri team that has been absolutely just awful at times offensively, for them to put up 92 points in that game. That is frustrating as it gets, I think, if you're Alabama, to kind of allow that from just a bad offensive team at times. And so I think that's the issue here is, look, if Alabama plays like they did against Missouri, they're going to get beat by 15 plus here in this game. I don't think they will. I think, as we say, you kind of know you're probably going to get a pretty close game between these two, just based on, the rivalry and everything that goes along with it. Just based on how it plays out, right? Like, you would expect Alabama to probably win this game, because when you think about it, they're winning the games that some people think are going to be a little bit more of a challenge, and they're losing the games that you don't think are going to be a challenge at all. And so that makes them very hard to predict. I think this is all about Alabama to me, because I think Auburn will bring it. I think Auburn's going to be fine here in terms of how they play, but if you don't get sort of the good Alabama we've seen against Gonzaga and Houston and those kind of games, the one at Florida, then I think you're certainly going to side with Auburn here. And quite frankly, I think we have to go up based off of what we've seen. And this is kind of feels like a big bounce back spot for Alabama at home after just, again, if you're Nate Oates and you wanted your team's attention, you certainly have it after that loss at Missouri. But at the same time, if I'm going to sit here and pick a game based on what I've seen from both teams, Auburn has been a significantly better team to this point. And you have to factor in atmosphere. You have to factor in that it's a road game and all these other things. But you're starting to lose trust in Alabama. And I haven't really lost trust in Auburn at this point. So I'm probably going to pick Auburn on the road here. I think that, again, this is where it's a rivalry game. They're so hard to predict in these kind of environments and those types of things. But I just think Auburn has been the more consistent and better team to this point. And you just have, your confidence level in Alabama has gone down after that loss to Missouri. So I think from that standpoint, it's hard not to pick Auburn here, even though, maybe with all the, the road environment, all those different things are probably telling you to go the other way. And maybe this is a big bounce back spot for Bama. I just think it's hard to pick against Auburn going into the game.
I'll give you a counterpoint. You started this by saying it's about Alabama. Well, Alabama's had 3 games like this, and it has come up big in all 3 of them. It beat Gonzaga in, I think, Seattle. It beat Houston at home, and it beat Tennessee at home. So if it's about Alabama, Alabama's answered the bell in these games. I guess what you could say is maybe there's a scouting report that's out on Alabama increasingly with every game, and perhaps that works to Auburn's advantage. But if you look at history, this is the kind of game where Alabama has played well this year, Blake.
Agreed. I think the issue, though, is we also saw Alabama play on Saturday, and we saw them lose against what at one point felt like the worst team in the SEC. And I know it's on the road, and I know it's those kind of things, but it's like, I don't know. Like, I can't come off of watching that game against Missouri and all of a sudden flip it to where I think that Alabama's going to beat Auburn. Like, I think that's the hard thing is, had they beaten Missouri, even if it was a struggle to beat Missouri, I probably would have picked Alabama to win this game. Like, I probably would have been like, yeah, this is one of those things where maybe they've struggled a little bit at times. Yeah, but they're coming back, to Tuscaloosa, and this is a good spot for them. But now it's like, I have no reason to pick Alabama to win this game because they just lost at Missouri. And it's like, I think that's the issue is Auburn, I've said it, is the clear number 1 team in the SEC at this point. And even though Auburn's going to lose some games along the way, and this might be one of them, I know Alabama has the history of stepping up in these big games, but man, when you lose the games that they're losing now, at some point, I think that methodology kind of goes out the window. And I wonder if maybe this is that point to where it's like, okay, you lost to Iona, you lost to Memphis, those kind of games, but you just lost to Missouri. And I'm, Missouri fans listen to this, I'm sorry, but they've had a struggle this season, as you know. And I just think that there was a lot of things in that game as you watch it, you're just like, well, there's a lot of things that rub you the wrong way about kind of Alabama playing right now. And that's the problem for me is, yes, I think that it makes a lot of sense to kind of go the opposite direction here and think that Alabama will step up and win. And this is, if you're expecting anything other than a close game, that's what this is going to be. It should be, I think, when you get these two out there and how they match up. But I can't. I've got to pick Auburn here because I don't think that, again, for me, the reason I'm picking Auburn is based off of what I've seen recently. And what I've seen recently is Auburn kind of run through a top team in LSU, a convincing win on the road against South Carolina, which I know South Carolina is a bottom half team, and then a double-digit win at home against Florida, even if they didn't play their best. They beat Florida by double digits. I think the body of work, to me, says go with Auburn in this one.
Okay, one quick point on Auburn, too. Auburn is one overtime away from being unbeaten. I think you can also argue, too, because if you make consistency an issue, and we've hammered on that with Alabama all year, that it just hasn't been consistent, I think you could argue Auburn's really only bad game was back November 19th, where it beat South Florida by 6 points, but even that was on the road. So this is the team that if you look at the most consistent teams in the country, I mean, other than Baylor, Auburn's been maybe as consistent as anyone.
Well, and here's the big matchup is this, right? Alabama, as we've said, not as good of a shooting team as they were a year ago. They're not as good of a defensive team as they were a year ago. And when you look at the numbers, right now Alabama is 8th in the country in 2-point percentage, 58.1%. Well, on the flip side of that, with Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, Auburn is 7th in 2-point field goal defense. They're only allowing teams to shoot 42.4% from, inside the arc. So if Alabama has an average 3-point shooting game, where are those points going to come from? Because I think it's going to be hard to get those points against Walker Kessler and Jabari Smith in there with those kind of guys, 6'10", 7'1". I think that's where the challenge comes in for Alabama, is they need a big shooting game. And they've proven they can do that. I don't have any doubts that they can. But I think that's it. Because I think the 2-point field goals are going to be hard to come by against Auburn. Just based on how, again, at less, right? You get guys in foul trouble. And I think that's Alabama's thing here. It's like if you can get, one of those guys in foul trouble, you're in good shape. But if not, good luck scoring in there because of how, especially with Kessler, right? Like with his shot blocking ability and all that. So I think those two guys in particular are going to impact this game. And that's where Alabama's going to have to make shots. And they're going to have to defend, like I just mentioned. I mean, you can't even come close to defending like you did against Missouri, or else, Auburn's going to put up 90 plus too. So that's the issue I have, at least on paper, with Alabama here, is I think that if they can't make enough shots from outside, I think it's going to be hard to get a lot of those good opportunities from inside because of who you're going up against.
You make a good point there, because I think maybe Florida hinted at a little bit of a blueprint on how to beat Auburn, and that's Colin Castleton. He had a really good game against them. Charles Bediako is a 5-star freshman for Alabama, but he's just not there yet. He was a total non-factor at Missouri. He's scored, I think, in his last dozen games or so, he's hit double digits once. That's 11 points. That's something Florida had that Alabama just right now does not.
Yeah, and that's, no offense to Bediako, right? But it's like he's not Colin Castleton yet. And I think that's one of those things in this game where I'm just very fascinated to kind of see it from a stylistic standpoint, how these two match up and what the approach is for Alabama and Auburn, for that matter. But I think that's another issue coming this game. And as we know, it's a basketball season, right? And there are going to be some strange games. And maybe we look back and the Alabama-Missouri game is just an outlier and one of those. But I don't know, because Alabama has been inconsistent. We've seen them lose games we didn't think they should. But also, as we said, they've proven they can beat Gonzaga and Houston and probably have the best pair of wins of anybody in the country this year. So that, is one of those things where I think it's much harder for me to bet on inconsistency than it is to bet on a team that, like you pointed out, is a double overtime loss away from being undefeated right now. And in that scenario, I'm going to bank on the team that, has probably proven a bit more at this point and has proven to be more consistent over a longer period of time. So,
any final thoughts before we end the podcast today?
Nope. Should be an interesting. I think this is actually a pretty interesting Tuesday slate here, like you mentioned. I think you feel pretty confident maybe that about some of these games in particular, but then, I don't know, like some of these are not as easy to figure out. And it wouldn't surprise me if we look up and you've got 4 games that are all very close. Wouldn't surprise me if you see, a couple blowouts here or there, whether that's Tennessee and South Carolina, Kentucky-Vanderbilt, or whatever. So pretty interesting slate of games.
Okay, for Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee of Southeastern 14. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another one of these on Tuesday.